versus coal?
Oh, gas is higher, and it can get higher. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it in a minute. You know, gas, especially the later gas plants, you know, a lot of the gas plants went in the 70s and 80s, actually. The big, you know, gas turbines. And when they started doing combined cycle gas turbines, that's when things got interested, and they got up in the 40s and 50s for electrical generation. And still, most of the heat was blown off of that. And that's where I'm going with this. But the primary thing I want you to take from this is, if you could double the generation side efficiency, let's talk about the utility side now, not your light bulbs. If you double the generation side efficiency, you cut the emissions by half. You cut the GHG, the greenhouse effect, by half of this industry. So that's the important thing. Well, I think the question on your mind is, can we double the efficiency of the combustion side? No, we can't. Thermodynamics, you can't double it. It actually turns out you can double it, because you may not be able to double the electrical side efficiency, but you can double the thermal efficiency of the energy. And the easy way to do it is to capture the waste heat. Remember I said 2/3 of the energy goes off as heat. Well, that heat is usable. And one of the ways it's usable is to recycle back into the process. This is what combined cycle turbines do. But you can also co-generate. If you know, a co-generation system, everybody knows what co is. Co is together. So if you together generate both electricity and heat and you utilize them both, you can get efficiencies way up in the 80s, approaching 90%. So it's not a difficult thing to do technologically. In fact, cogeneration technology has been around since, well, it really started taking off in the 1980s, in the early 1980s with cogeneration. And fundamentally, all they were doing in the 1980s was taking combustion engines that ran on natural gas and putting jackets on the exhaust, right? And taking the waste heat from the exhaust and either running it into another turbine or utilizing it in some other way. Okay, so doubling the efficiency is not difficult to do technologically. All you got, it's like discovering recycling, you know, you're just recycling the waste energy. You know, it's like, when did we discover recycling? That was Earth Day, right? In the 1970s or something. So, you know, if the cogen heyday and the cogen technology has been out since the 1980s, again, why doesn't cogen at double the efficiency, why doesn't that dominate what we're doing? So again, I have too simplistic a solution on my hands. The truth is, you can't just say, well, just install cogeneration, because it didn't happen. So the question is, why didn't it happen? The mystery continues. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the story of cogeneration, or non-cogeneration really, in New Mexico. And the acronym PNM is going to come up, and I don't want this to turn into a session where we beat up on a utility, because all the utilities were doing what PNM is still doing, but was doing, you know, much more back then. So this isn't an indictment of a particular utility, but I do want to tell a personal story about it, a couple of personal stories, in fact. In the 1980s, New Mexico had some of the highest rates for electricity in the country. Incredibly expensive electricity here. In fact, I think at one time PNM held the distinction of having the highest rates in the country at about that time. Part of the reason the rates were so high was because of the buildup of the 70s and the early 80s, and really, I guess they were the 70s, when we were building Palo Verde nuclear and we were building coal-fired power plants and huge. There were all these projections that the economy was going to go up and up and up and up and up. And of course, the Arab oil embargo in the 70s kind of, you know, sent us into a recession, and we didn't end up using all the electricity that was predicted. And, you know, not all of it was good planning. In fact, utilities didn't have to do great planning back then, because they had something called full cost recovery. In fact, it was the predominant form of regulation is cost plus regulation. You know, there used to be jokes in the power industry. It's the only industry in the world where you can redecorate your office and increase your profit. And that was true, because under a cost plus contract, it's the more you spend, the more you make. And to some extent, that still exists. So under cost plus contracting, huge predictions that the economy was going to grow, the power companies built as much stuff as they could to earn as much money as they could. So at one time in the early 80s, PNM had what's called an 83%, what's called a reserve margin. In other words, they had 83% more productive capacity than they were actually delivering. And anybody who knows anything about economics of a project, when you do project engineering, it's asset utilization is what counts. If you build a big asset and it doesn't get used and just sits there idle, it's hard to make the payments. Okay, so asset utilization was incredibly low. They built very, very expensive. The cost overruns in nuclear were legends. Some of you, I'm sure, studied and looked at that. Whether you're a fan of nuclear or not, the cost overruns were legend. So at that time, again, we had high electricity rates, and natural gas, however, was very cheap. We're in a producing region. And there was a gas company here. The gas line had been run from, what was the name of that company that ran it down here from the Four Corners? I can't remember either. Santa Fe Gas or something. Anyway, they ran a gas pipe down here from the Four Corners. We're in what's called the producing region. So gas was cheap, electricity was high, and the difference between those two costs in the industry is called the spark spread. It means how much extra money would you make if you set the gas on fire and then sold the product. So the spark spread, it tells you how much more valuable the electricity is than the gas itself. And the spark spread was huge. When the spark spread is huge, everybody that knows how to build a generator to make electricity gets excited. So in the early 80s, what was happening in New Mexico was all these cogeneration companies were forming because there were new cogeneration equipment manufacturers developing these heat jackets that I was talking about on the exhaust. So there's all these new technologies coming out, there's all this new equipment, they're going in all over the country, and there are cogeneration companies starting up in New Mexico, and they're running around looking for contracts. They're running around looking to help people save energy on their electric bill by installing cogenerators. And these cogenerators are small now, they're on site. You can get them in all these different sizes. They're fundamentally just engines. And the engine blows off heat and you capture that heat. So the ideal customer for a cogeneration system is one that has a large heat load as well as a large electric load. That would be hotels, swimming pools, manufacturing facilities that use process heat. You know, there's all kinds of them. There's all kinds of places where you can use electricity and heat together on site. So, a couple of these companies, there are about 4 or 5 of these companies running around New Mexico, starting in the early 80s. One of them was called Zond Energy. One of them was called EPS for Energy Productivity Systems. And there were several others with various specialties. And they're running around, and here's some of the clients they're going after. The St. Joseph's Hospital in Albuquerque, Inn of the Governors, the Centex plant. Was that sheetrock? Centex? What was it, home building? Yeah, there was also a gypsum plant, though, down in Bernalillo. Remember that? It ran till a few years ago with that big plume of steam coming out. That's a process heat system. That's how you knew when you got to Bernalillo, that big plume of steam coming out of the sheetrock plant. They're using a lot of heat. Garrett's Swim Club. Does anybody remember Garrett's Swim and Racket Club? Did it turn into the Garretts who now own the Garrett's Desert Inn? I don't know if it's the same people. Aren't there some old-time Santa Feans here? Don't you guys know these questions? All right, I was hoping you'd help me. The State Penitentiary was looking at it. The State Pen has a huge heat load. Loveless Hospital, UNM. So the big universities often have cogeneration systems. Most big universities have cogen systems on site. So as I said, these 4 or 5 cogen companies are going to all these clients, and it's a fairly simple analysis. You take their electricity use, and you look at their heat usage, to heat their swimming pool or do their laundry or whatever they're using the heat for. And then you look at the output profile of a cogenerator, and you size the cogen to meet the heat load, and the electricity that it produces comes directly off your electric bill. And we had at that time a law called PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act. And PURPA was actually trying to encourage the installation of cogeneration systems at that time. So PURPA was out there demanding that these cogen systems, that utilities allow these cogen systems to be installed. These cogen companies were easily getting a hold of the equipment. The customers were clearly going to save a ton of money. And after about 3 years of this, going around to all these companies and running engineering load profiles, how many cogen systems had been installed? And the answer is none. None. After 3 years of running around. And now the question again is, why? Well, I can tell you why. And this is where, again, we don't want to turn it into a personal indictment, because as I said, every utility was doing this. P&M had a group within P&M called the Cogeneration Group. It was actually part of a group called Load Development. Load development, you can't really blame them for. I mean, if you sell widgets, you'd like people to use more widgets. If you sell golf balls, we want people doing more golfing. If you sell electricity, you want more electricity being used. So they had this group called the Load Development Group. And all of it was about, increasing people's use of appliances and electricity. And, remember gold medallion homes? I grew up in a gold medallion home. They were building entire neighborhoods and not letting gas lines, in there. And they were just building all electric homes, and they were selling that as the really clean way to get your energy. Gold medallion, So you can't blame them for the load development group, but why was the cogen group part of the load development group? And the answer is, it wasn't the cogen development group, it was the cogen deferral group. It was the cogen squash group, yeah. Now, this probably all sounds like conjecture. And so what I did is I brought along a notebook. You can see how thick it is. And this notebook contains internal memos from P&M. These are inter-office memos from both the gas division and the electric division. As an interesting aside, the gas division of P&M was pissed off about the suppression of cogeneration by the electric side. And you can read it in these memos. I'm going to read to you a few little parts of some of these memos. And then we're going to talk about what I'm doing with a notebook full of P&M inter-office memos.
Got it from the NSA.
I did. Edward Snowden sent this directly to me. That's exactly what happened. Oh, he wasn't the first one to discover corruption. Okay, here's an interview for the EPRI Journal. You all know the Electric Power Research Institute. It's actually a nonprofit, but it's the research arm of the electric utilities. They run on a budget of about $300 million a year as a nonprofit, as a 501c3 nonprofit. And they all sit around at EPRI, and they not only look at all the new technologies, but they look at how to suppress all the new technologies. That's really what EPRI has famously done over the years. So they would interview people like P&M executives, and this particular interview was with a fellow who I won't name, but he was the senior vice president of operations for P&M at the time. He says, "We as an industry better start recognizing that our customers can go elsewhere. The strategy being pursued by P&M is twofold. First, we consolidate and secure existing markets by increasing the nature and quality of service, preventing market share leakage, and erecting market entry and exit barriers." What does a market entry and exit barrier mean? I can give you some examples, and these were ones that were actively used and on the book. A market entry barrier is when somebody comes to you with a cogeneration project, and this is the key now. These cogeneration companies that were trying to sell these generators were going to the customers first, and then at some point you need to interconnect that generator, because we're not talking about cutting your P&M line, we're talking about generating in parallel. They would have to take their generator, their customer rather, into P&M and negotiate an interconnection, because you have to connect it to the power grid. So you're going to the person who you're taking the business away from and asking their permission. Now the PURPA Act, as I told you, required that the utilities not do unfair things regarding that interconnection. But there, I have depositions also. This is only one of my notebooks. I have several more notebooks with depositions from the guys who were running the cogen companies. And P&M was throwing one thing after another at the interconnection requirement. Gold-plated relays, isolation transformers, things that doubled the cost of the project. And they had a number of other tricks, which I'll get into. But that's a market entry barrier. You have to go to your competitor and ask their permission and interconnect on their terms. A market exit barrier means, how do I prevent that company from actually going to this other guy, to the cogenerator? And there's a number of ways to do market exit barriers. Primarily, the most egregious one, which has a lot to do why I have this notebook, was you could give them a special price to not leave. Or you could give them a penalty if they do leave. And the penalty was called an exit fee. And the other penalty, which they used a lot of, was called a standby charge. And the argument goes like this. Yeah, you're currently a 100 kilowatt load, but you're putting in a 30 kilowatt generator. But every time you turn the generator off for maintenance, I got to give you the other 30 kilowatts. So what I have to do as the supplier of energy is I have to keep that 30 kilowatts in standby mode. I have to maintain a power plant for you in case you ever turn off the generator. Now that argument works if you have one generator on the line. By the time the penetration is thousands of generators, it no longer holds up. You just see some averaging of those 1,000 generators and when they all go on and off. So it's a ridiculous argument, but that's a market exit barrier. So again, we have a P&M senior VP bragging in the EPRI Research Journal about market entry and exit barriers. Let me give you a couple more because these get good. This is an inter-office memo by the Cogen Planning Group Manager. Remember I said they had a Cogen Planning Group, and it wasn't planning that they get installed, it was planning on how to not get them installed. And this is it. This is a document called Customer Generation Deferral Plan Strategy Options. So again, they're trying to defer the installation. They're trying to extend, push down the road, or kill these installations. And this is called a situation analysis paper. So she's writing about how to defer these cogenerators. And she starts out, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's footnoted, and it says in the footnote that that's Charles Dickens. Does anybody? Okay.
Tale of Two Cities.
Okay, good. I'm glad we're up to speed, at least on the literature part of the talk. So here's a paragraph I want to read you. One of P&M's oldest and most conventional methods of competing with customer generation, competing being the keyword, has been its customer analysis capability. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute. Indeed, many potential projects have been killed in this manner. The most recent example is St. Joseph Hospital, while others have been stalled or put on hold. Recently, third-party financed energy management equipment and equipment rebates have been added to the arsenal. However, until some form of direct price competition is implemented, the arsenal remains incomplete. So here's a little explanation of that. P&M was using what are called price strategy options and non-price strategy options. And the price strategy option is clear. They go in and they give the customer a special deal in exchange for an agreement not to sign on with the generator. Special rates. Some of them it was legal, some of it was illegal. We'll get into it in a little bit. But that's the price strategy. That's the risky one. That one you're really risking an antitrust lawsuit. The non-price strategy ones are where, you remember I told you the cogen guy has to go into the P&M office and ask for the interconnection. Well, the P&M guys weren't only ready to, quote, gold-plated standards for an expensive interconnection. They were ready with a thermal and electrical analysis of the customer to show that cogeneration wasn't viable financially. Now, how was P&M able to do that? They had all the records. They were the gas company and the electric company. So they would analyze the load profile and come up with their own analysis and talk about the future of electricity rates are really going to be stable. They're never going up again. And so this cogeneration idea will never pay itself back. And the stories from these cogenerators walking into these meetings is that they'd walk in with their customer, they're a guy in jeans with a 2-page analysis showing this incredible profit, and there'd be 10 P&M guys around the table and a stack of computer printouts on the table. And they would drop analysis after analysis on the table, convincing the customer in front of the cogen guy that they shouldn't go ahead with cogen. Story after story after story on that. So that's a non-price. That's a less risky way to do it. It's going to be expensive and you're never going to get your money back. They would put uncertainty in the deal, and that was the second way that they killed these projects. This next memo, I want to show you how much fun they were having doing this. P&M would also go out to the site and meet on-site with the client, the potential cogenerator, to help convince them that cogeneration wasn't a good idea, and sometimes the cogen contractor would be there. And this was after a particular meeting in Bernalillo, which I assume was that sheetrock plant down there. That was the big cogen load down in Bernalillo at that time. And here's a memo from a cogen group engineer to his boss. It's not often that the cogen busters can spot 2 or at least 1.5 alien eggs in one day. The cogen busters. This was their job. This is what they were getting a salary to do, was to go to these companies and prevent the installation of this technology. The cogen busters. And then here's the reply memo from his boss 8 minutes later. Good insight on your part. This is exciting! Exclamation point. Stay on top of things and let's squash this egg. They're actually delighting in the fact that they're going after these cogen systems and killing them. I have lots of these. I picked out my 4 favorites just for you guys. And then this, as I said, was the really interesting part. P&M had an electric division that operated separately from the gas division. And while the electric division was giddy with laughter over shutting down these cogen projects, the gas division was like, that was new business for us. Cogenerators suck up a fair amount of gas, right? They burn a lot of natural gas. So the cogen group, the natural gas division was kind of pissed about it. So here's a letter between, here's a memo. It's called Cogeneration Update. This is an inter-office correspondence on the gas side. It says, our inability to develop a file a cogeneration rate, coupled with the effectiveness of the electric companies in discouraging the equipment vendors from seeking and getting interconnections, has kept the bustle of activity from developing into any contracts at this time. Bustle of activity has not developed into a single contract. So this is like 3 years in. Not a single cogen contract is on the ground, despite the bustle of activity. Everybody wants a cogen, nobody can get it. This notebook will be here for you to peruse after the talk is done. I need to keep my eyes on it, though. The reason I have this notebook is as follows. Because on July 19, 1998, one of the cogen vendors filed an antitrust lawsuit under the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts, and also citing restraint of trade under the New Mexico antitrust laws. And he took P&M to court for erecting barriers to entry, restricting access, and misrepresenting economics. These are all restraint of trade. They're punishable under antitrust law, both state and federal. And if you know anything about antitrust law, what you collect is triple damages should you successfully prosecute an antitrust. So here's all these companies. Only one of them was suing. But don't forget, once the precedent is set, everybody jumps on board because they're easy. It's easy after that point. So this was filed in 1988. Did I say 98? This was 1988. So this had been going on for a few years. They filed this lawsuit. On April 28th of 1992, 4 years later, this is 4 years of depositions and interrogatories and lawyers back and forth, and motions to protect protection orders and motions to appeal and compel and blah blah. 4 years. I don't know if any of you. I actually paid an attorney for an hour and a half of his time the other day, and it was $400. This fella was in 4 years with his team of 3 attorneys. I have no idea how much money he put out to do this. But this wasn't even the trial. This is the pre-trial hearing. 4 years. And at 4 years, the judge ordered a settlement conference. I don't know how the settlement idea came up. Perhaps there was a buzz in the room that it was looking like, as I say, there's a lot more memos, and these memos are pretty damning. So the judge orders him to go to a settlement conference. No settlement is reached. So on May 12, 1992, again 4 years into this thing, the judge scheduled a jury selection and a trial. In other words, he stamped jury trial on the docket, said, boy, there looks like enough evidence here to go to trial. Why don't we sit with the jury and start calling in jurors? That sent P&M back to the negotiating table with this particular vendor, and he settled for an undisclosed amount of money. The settlement was sealed. What's that?
So that's part of the deal.
That's part of the deal. Yeah, you settle for an undisclosed amount of money, and guess what you get in return is a gag order. So we thought for years, a lot of us knew, and a month later, a motion for dismissal due to settlement was issued by the judge, so the whole case went away. So 4 years of testimony, all this discovery, inter-office memos. Now, I knew about this case for years, and I was told that the case was sealed. And one day I was in Albuquerque walking down the street, and I was passing the Pete Domenici Federal Courthouse, and I walked in and just asked for the case, and they handed it to me. It turned out the case wasn't sealed, only the settlement was sealed. And that's what I'm doing with this notebook. So you can find out this stuff and read it. Am I getting late?
We're getting ready.
Okay, we're getting ready for questions. So that's the real reason. And to think that anything's changed. So what did P&M do after paying this, I'm sure, multi-million-dollar settlement? I mean, just the lawyers' fees had to be in the millions, right? I'm sure they had a big settlement. So what does P&M do as a result of this? Do they, put their tail between their legs and promise to always be better about cogeneration? People cogenerating will just roll over and that's that? P&M went to the legislature, and they got a law passed called the load retention rate, allowing them to do, under state law, what they had been doing illegally in this case. The load retention rate. And the logic went like this. We have all this spare generation capacity, so we don't want people building their own. You know, that generation capacity is costing us money and therefore costing ratepayers money. And if it's costing us money and ratepayers money, we'd be better off putting it to use and not using it less. So they got this thing called a load retention rate, allowing them to go to any customer who was looking to leave the system and offer them some sweet deal. It wasn't even supposed to be a secret deal. It was supposed to be a known deal that they filed publicly, but they weren't. They were all filed as secret deals. It's called the load retention rate, and that load retention rate has been on the books ever since, and it never comes up. Nobody ever even talks about it. I don't know who's got the load retention rate. I suspect all those companies I mentioned have a load retention rate. But if the utility has the right to go negotiate in secret to any potential client who leaves the system, what do you got? Now, a few years later, as Zaylee said in my introduction, I installed the first net metered system legally connected to P&M's grid. In other words, I got an interconnection agreement. And when I got the interconnection agreement, David Bacon was the client, by the way, and a bunch of you know David Bacon. David Bacon said, Mark, build me one of those systems, you know, to run my electricity meter backwards. And I did. When P&M came down with the interconnection agreement, we read it. And the interconnection agreement has a clause. And that clause says, not verbatim, but this is what the clause says in legal effect. The utility retains the right to disconnect this system at any time, for any reason, at its discretion, at your expense, with no recourse. So, you know, some of you have put $20,000 solar power systems on your house. I don't blame you for doing that. I don't think the company is going to come out and force you to interconnect it. But there is now a state statute. As I say, all these things start out in one way and then they get codified in state law. There is a state statute that I swear, I'm not a lawyer, but I've read a lot of law. This statute reads, and this is almost verbatim. Didn't have time to dig it out. It starts out, if the utility believes. What does the word believes mean in law? Does it? Accepts. Yeah. If the utility believes that anything connected to its system may be problematic. May be problematic. I don't know what these words mean in law. If the utility believes that anything connected to its system may be problematic, it can disconnect it and send a letter to the person that they disconnected telling them why. And this remains in effect. So this is how you stop the loan process. If you've ever been to a bank and tried to get a loan on a project, let's say you want $1 million to put in a cogeneration system. And they say, well, what kind of a deal do you have with the utility? Well, I got a deal that says they can disconnect it anytime for any reason. It makes it pretty hard to finance. So that's what's going on in the interconnection of the utility system. Now, I did promise, I'm running almost overtime here, but I'm not. I'm okay. It's still 10 to 12. I did promise I would talk something about the solution to this. The only way you can actually get the power grid to evolve, because we all know that evolution of technology evolves decentralization. So right now we have predominantly a couple of big centralized power plants, and what we're trying to get to is a vast array of distributed power plants. That's what you need to get to. But again, you can't get there from here because they control the interconnection of all of them. So if you want to get down the road to that state, I don't recommend that you vote solar. I don't recommend that you put in wind and force the utility. I recommend that you address this core problem, that the person and the entity that you're competing with has full control over your ability to install, your financing on the system, your payback on the system. You can't have your competitor in charge of your market, in charge of your market entry. They're still doing the same things with market barriers. That is the problem. Now, the problem with going at it like, ooh, we need to install solar panels is like saying, imagine right now that it's 1965 and all of you have a rotary-dial telephone at home and you're disgusted because you have to go home to make your phone calls. And, you're not going to advocate for iPhones. It's 1965. You have no idea what the future looks like. And the same is true in the electric industry. You don't want to advocate for a particular technology. What you want to do is open that market to evolution, allow it to evolve, and guide it gently toward the thing you want it to evolve to. This is complex systems theory. All a complex system needs to evolve in some strategic way, whether it's a bunch of birds taking off at the bosque and then assembling themselves into this gorgeous pattern, or honeybees leaving the nest. All they need is a platform on which to evolve and a few simple rules allowing it to organize in a particular way. So this is what, and this isn't speculation, the country of Denmark actually did this. They seized the power grid, the entire country's power grid, out of private hands. It was owned by 3 private transmission companies, and they nationalized it. And they rewrote the charter for it, saying this power grid is for the purpose of guaranteed access by every Danish citizen, number 1. Guaranteed access. None of this utility crap. Guaranteed access by every citizen, number 1. Number 2, peak efficiency. And again, efficiency is the flip side of the pollution. The higher the efficiency, the lower the pollution. And if you would drive this thing toward efficiency and allow it to evolve by whatever the best technologies are and gently incentivize the ones that are most beneficial, the power grid will proceed on a course of evolution, just like the telephone turned into the iPhone, or the typewriter turned into the computer, or the 8-track tape turned into the iPod, or whatever it is now. Sorry to be plugging Apple. But that is my contention on the power system for years. I don't promote solar, I don't promote wind, I don't promote geothermal. I promote decentralization by the most beneficial technologies simply as a matter of opening up the market. And the market's never been open. So that's what I think we ought to do. And that's all I have to say, especially because Ethan has his hand up and it's time for a question from the cameraman. Okay, thank you very much, you guys. I really appreciate it.
For the sake of good sound,
Thank
can
you.
you speak into that?
Can a community rights ordinance be used to do what he just said, the same way that in Moore County they banned fracking? Can we use a community rights ordinance to open up the market?
Great question. I think the utility grid is an incredibly important infrastructure. Imagine if the power grid goes down. There's no other single machine that could go down that would change your life as dramatically as the power grid going down. So it's very closely controlled and watched, and that's why that's part of the reason it's been very hard. The arguments over whether you adding something to the grid is dangerous or not are highly technical. I happen to be on the IEEE committee that decides that. But to get to your answer, if the grid is owned by an investor-owned utility, probably not. Because all this stuff is like national security at some level. And this is where the movement came out. We were, always somebody's been here before I was, but 15 years ago we had a big push, 14 years ago, a huge push to municipalize the utility in Santa Fe. And there are thousands of municipal utilities around the country. And that is the way you get control of the interconnection requirements, is you create a community or municipal locally owned utility, because the utility sets the interconnection standards, and as long as you have this big behemoth. Don't forget, again, I said this wasn't personal against P&M. I'm not upset with anybody who works at P&M. P&M is owned institutionally. It's like some 85% the last time I checked them, I don't know what the number is, of the stock ownership is institutions. It's all owned by insurance conglomerates, investment houses, the guys that were doing all the mortgage fraud are basically who own P&M. So I think the answer to your question, Ethan, is no. Until you get local control, how are you going to impose your interconnection standards on the investor-owned utility? I think it's hard. Municipalization is very possible, and it's likely you need the public support behind it, and that's been hard because some of the issues are technical. But that is what we need as a community utility. Tell me your name, too, because I know you.
James Stewart.
That's right.
I grew up with the hydropower on the Columbia River, so
right on.
wheeling power all the way to here sometimes. But
Yeah, I don't
a lot of
doubt that.
hydro and a lot of cheap electricity. So we grew up with those kinds of houses, modest though they may be, that are just electric top to bottom and no questions.
Well, yeah.
That's a sidebar.
And if you're drawing from hydro, it is fairly clean, but
Yeah, don't ask the salmon, but okay.
yeah, there's always a drawback. All right.
But at any rate, what I wanted to ask is, are there any states or municipalities that have made major progress toward loosening the grip of the big utilities and bringing some of these things a little more under under the kind of control and more open markets that you're talking about. Can
Yeah,
you
you
point
bet.
to some examples?
Oddly, Texas is one. Texas has its own grid. Y'all know this. There's 3 actual grids in the U.S. There's the Eastern Connection, the Western Connection, and Texas has their own. So they've been able to do stuff absent of FERC, because there's no interstate trade down there. So they've done some things to encourage, certainly wind, but a lot of other stuff. The answer is, in terms of municipal utilities, the first and most famous one is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, funnily called SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And they really promoted early studies of, utilities used to always claim if you hook all these generators to the grid, you'd get instability. And so they famously took a feeder line that was feeding a neighborhood, and they put not only a ton of local solar at that time, generators on it, they put it all on one phase. That's a little technical, but the utility grid is fundamentally, they call it single phase, but nonetheless, 220 power actually has 2 phases and they're out of phase, but they put it all on one side to see if they could destabilize or imbalance the system, and it wouldn't do it. It's very, very hard to destabilize the utility system. So yeah, SMUD did the early studies on that in the 80s, and they got higher penetration until Gainesville, Florida, interestingly created a municipal utility, and I think they ended up with the highest penetration of decentralized generation. What's the Gainesville, Florida utility? I think it's called Gainesville Municipal Electric or something like that, but that's a good one to look up. And then I haven't done any research, but I understand the state of Nebraska does not allow an investor-owned utility in the state. I think the state of Nebraska owns its power grid. And I think all of the power companies that serve that grid in the state are either cooperative or local. I don't know that they have multinationals in there. By the way, that is one of the things you have to push for in this whole thing is separation. You can't have the company that owns the grid also own the generation. That's the main thing. I do believe the entire power grid of the U.S. should be a public asset, just like the highways and the sewer systems and the water systems. You really don't want to go with privatization of the essential infrastructure. Privatization of the generation, that I can sort of dig. But I think the grid itself has to be a public asset. Yeah?
Why doesn't PNM see it as a win-win situation to adopt or embrace the cogeneration and control that?
Did everybody hear that? Why does PNM not see it as a win-win situation to embrace the cogeneration?
And control that.
They talked about it a lot back then, and there was, they were doing studies actually on whether or not it was revenue neutral, because again, they owned the gas company too. So they were looking at the profits on the gas side compared to the profits on the electric side, and deciding if this whole thing was a good idea. Ultimately, they decided to stay with it kind of regardless of the revenue impact. I think they made more money by holding on to the complete control of the electric side. The answer to your question is somewhat of a complex one, and it gives me a chance to go into this section of it. Power, they don't call these companies the power companies for no reason. As I said, there's not a more important infrastructure than the power system. So when you control the power system, you control a lot of other kinds of power too. You control political power and financial power. If anybody remembers the power grid blackout of 2003 in New York, and everybody told the story, we went outside and met our neighbors for the first time. What I remember about the power grid going down in 2003 was the next day, after they took them a day to restore it or 2 days, and then the very next day, George W. Bush stood on the stump in front of America and he said, we must give these companies $20 billion to improve their infrastructure so that this never happens again. And I thought to myself, boy, if I had a switch and I could turn it off and turn it back on and have the president, he's a pretty good lobbyist, and have the president saying, everybody must give Mark Sardella $20 billion immediately. I don't know if I'd turn off the switch. I think I might. So the answer to your question is a complicated one, but it gets into the whole philosophy of energy and how we share energy. Your entire life is energy. Everybody talks about water is life. Your life doesn't end when you run out of water. Your body is still actually full of water. Your life ends when all electrical and all energetic processes stop. When your brain stops making these chemical impulses, that's when you're actually dead. So energy is life, and all the energy comes from the sun. And the sun disperses that energy in the way that created a biosphere with 100 million species living in perfect harmony. And we come along and we set up these crazy rules on distribution of energy, and we end up basically screwing up the whole thing, if I may be candid. So I think we're into a deeper question of philosophy, and I think the power grid offers a bigger opportunity than anyone thinks for us to evolve and how we think about the sharing of energy among society. You know, the rules that you set, I mean, we actually have a wire connecting all of us. It's kind of neat. And we could set the rules on that power sharing so that we ended up with a society and a political system that was a little more fair and democratic. I think it's the root of inequality, actually, is these power rules.
One follow-up question, if I may. One follow-up question, if I may. Do the power companies around New Mexico as well have means by which they suppress media exposure of this?
It's called advertising.
That's advertising is one, a brainwashing. I mean, doesn't General Electric owns NBC, right? Ownership of the media companies is a good one. So I don't know what goes on behind the scenes, but again, the power in power company is the important word. They control a lot of stuff, and when you get into the arguments around this stuff, they are pretty technical. I understand why these lawsuits have been hard to prosecute. So their ability to suppress it. They were making arguments this whole time. The three main lies they told, and this is what they tell in the advertisements in the commercials. Well, it's not really, actually. They talk about the benefits that'll accrue to them. But, they constantly say in these different forums that, anything other than the central technique will result in, more expensive, unreliable, and dangerous. You're going to kill alignment with this decentralization. So they still stand on top of reasons that don't, in my technical estimations, hold water. But I am highly technical, and I've been in this for a long time. And, the public doesn't, by and large, people don't know the difference. So I think the answer is they can tell the lies with pretty good impunity, and they're doing a good job of it. Let's do one or two more. How many? Okay. Yes?
I'm currently installing some solar panels on my house, and I could have a couple of minutes here. I could explain some of the technical details relating to P&M about this, and I
think you have to do it quick. What time are we going till? Yeah, I think just a couple of minutes, if you don't mind. I took up all the time is what happened, so sorry about that.
Certainly talk to him afterwards as well.
Yeah, we can do that. But sure, go ahead, quick.
Well, I think P&M has there's a law that requires them to increase the renewable energy that they have on their grid per year, and
They just got it lowered, didn't they?
Yeah, they work constantly on lowering it, but yeah.
I think it's about 10 to 15%, somewhere in that range. Anyway, I'm connecting my solar panels to the P&M system, and I connected on the house side of the meter so that when the solar system in my house produces electricity, it runs that meter backwards. But in the agreement with P&M, they don't mention net metering. They just have what they call a REC agreement, which is you monitor the amount of electricity that the solar panels produce, and they'll give you 4 cents per kilowatt hour on that. And as long as that net metering is in effect, the grid provides basically a battery for me to store my solar panel energy while the sun is shining, and then when at night, then P&M will supply electricity to my house, and that's a good thing, I think.
And they used to pay more, didn't they? It was way the rate. Weren't they paying more than 4 cents, and they just get that lower?
Really dropped it huge.